The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the great palace in Constantinople, its golden rays illuminating mosaics that depicted Christ's mercy and divine justice. But beneath those sacred images, in chambers that never saw daylight, a different reality unfolded. Iron chains clinked against stone walls as human shadows moved in darkness, their faces bearing the hollow expressions of souls who had learned that in the empire that called itself the heir to Rome, mercy was a luxury reserved for the free. This wasn't the slavery of cotton plantations or sugar mills that history books often describe. This was something far more insidious, a system so deeply woven into the fabric of Christian civilization that it had become invisible, sanctified by theology and justified by law. The Byzantine Empire, that thousand-year beacon of Orthodox Christianity, had perfected the art of human bondage with the same sophistication it brought to its architecture and its theology. In the workshops beneath the city's churches, slave children no older than 7 worked 18-hour days crafting the silk vestments that adorned bishops and emperors. In the palace kitchens, eunuch slaves prepared feasts for nobles who discussed the salvation of souls between courses prepared by hands that would never know freedom. In the harbors of the Golden Horn, slave galleys powered by human misery carried goods blessed by priests who preached about the dignity of all God's children. But the true horror wasn't in the brutality, it was in the sophistication. The Byzantines had created a slavery so refined, so legally complex, so theologically justified, that its victims often couldn't tell where bondage ended and freedom began. They had weaponized Christianity itself, turning the promise of salvation into a tool of control and the hope of heaven into a reason to accept hell on earth. Before we descend into this labyrinth of sanctified suffering, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next exploration into history's most disturbing contradictions. Now, prepare yourself. The bells of Hagia Sophia are ringing, and beneath their sacred chimes, we can hear the rattle of chains that bound millions in the name of God. The sacred marketplace, where souls were sold, the slave market of Constantinople, sprawled across the shadow of Hagia Sophia like a cancer growing in the heart of Christendom. Here, beneath the dome that proclaimed God's glory to the world, human beings were bought and sold with the same casual efficiency that merchants applied to spices and silk. But this wasn't the crude brutality of barbarian raiders, this was commerce sanctified by law, blessed by custom, and justified by the most sophisticated theological minds of the age. The market operated with a precision that would have impressed any modern corporation. Slaves were categorized by origin, skill, age, and physical condition, their human worth reduced to entries in ledgers that recorded transactions with the same care applied to imperial tax records. A young Slavic girl might be listed as virgin, literate, suitable for household service, 12 gold solidi. A captured Arab scholar could command 20 solidi, knows Greek and Latin, experienced in mathematics and astronomy. But the true sophistication lay in the legal framework that governed these transactions. Byzantine law, refined over centuries of jurisprudence, had created categories of bondage so complex that they required specialized lawyers to navigate. There were slaves born into bondage, slaves captured in war, slaves who had sold themselves to pay debts, slaves who were being punished for crimes, and slaves who had been enslaved by their own families as children. Each category carried different rights, different obligations, and different possibilities for freedom. The theological justification was even more elaborate. Church fathers had spent centuries developing arguments that slavery was not only compatible with Christianity but actually mandated by divine will. They pointed to biblical passages that commanded slaves to obey their masters, to New Testament letters that returned runaway slaves to their owners, to Christ himself who had never explicitly condemned the institution. Slavery, they argued, was part of God's plan for human society, a necessary hierarchy that reflected the cosmic order of heaven itself. The market's location was no accident. By placing it in the shadow of the greatest church in Christendom, the Byzantines were making a statement about the compatibility of faith and bondage. Merchants could buy slaves in the morning and attend divine liturgy in the afternoon, their consciences clear because they were participating in a system that had been blessed by the highest authorities of church and state. The selection process was a masterpiece of dehumanization disguised as commercial efficiency. Potential buyers examined slaves like livestock, testing their teeth, checking their muscles, and evaluating their breeding potential. But unlike simple animal husbandry, this examination was conducted by people who shared the same fundamental humanity as their victims, who worshipped the same God, and who claimed to believe in the same moral principles. The psychological impact on the slaves was devastating and deliberate. They were forced to stand naked while strangers evaluated their worth, to perform tasks that demonstrated their skills, to answer questions about their backgrounds and abilities. The message was clear: they were not people but property, not souls created in God's image but commodities to be bought and sold for profit. The prices reflected the market's sophisticated understanding of human value. Beautiful young women commanded premium prices, not just for their physical attractiveness but for their potential as status symbols for wealthy households. Educated slaves were valued for their intellectual abilities, their literacy making them useful as secretaries, tutors, and administrators. Skilled craftsmen brought high prices because their abilities could generate ongoing income for their owners. But the market also dealt in more specialized merchandise. Eunuchs, created through the deliberate mutilation of young boys, were particularly prized for palace service because their castration supposedly made them safe around imperial women. These living victims of systematic child abuse commanded enormous prices, their suffering transformed into commercial value by a society that claimed to cherish the innocence of children. The international nature of the slave trade revealed the global reach of Byzantine exploitation. Slavic peoples from the north provided a steady stream of captives whose very name had become synonymous with bondage. African slaves arrived through trade networks that stretched across the Sahara, their exotic appearance making them valuable as curiosities and status symbols. Prisoners of war from the empire's endless conflicts were processed through the market like any other commodity, their defeat in battle transforming them from enemies into property. The financing of slave purchases was as sophisticated as any modern commercial transaction. Wealthy buyers could arrange credit, paying for their human property in installments that might stretch over years. Insurance policies protected against the loss of valuable slaves through death or escape. Contracts specified warranties about health, skills, and background, with legal remedies available if the merchandise failed to meet specifications. The market's daily rhythms reflected the casual normality of human trafficking in Byzantine society. Merchants arrived before dawn to inspect the new arrivals, examining their potential purchases by torchlight before the day's bidding began. Wealthy households sent stewards to acquire specific types of slavisa cook for the kitchen, a tutor for the children, a concubine for the master's pleasure. Even middle-class families might save for months to purchase a single slave, their human property representing a significant investment in their household status and efficiency. The documentation required for slave ownership was extensive and revealing. Bills of sale had to specify the slave's origin, age, health status, and any special skills or limitations. Registration with imperial authorities ensured that ownership was legally recognized and that taxes on slave property would be properly collected. These records, preserved in Byzantine archives, provide a chilling glimpse into a society that had bureaucratized human bondage with the same efficiency it applied to any other aspect of imperial administration. The eunuch factories, manufacturing broken men in the shadowy workshops scattered throughout the empire's provinces, an industry of unimaginable cruelty operated with the efficiency of any other Byzantine enterprise. These were the eunuch factories, places where young boys were systematically mutilated to create the castrated servants that Byzantine society prized above all other slaves. The process was so refined, so technically sophisticated, that it had become a specialized craft passed down through generations of practitioners who had learned to transform children into commodities with surgical precision. The demand for eunuchs in Byzantine society was enormous and multifaceted. The imperial court required hundreds of castrated servants for palace administration, their mutilation supposedly guaranteeing loyalty and eliminating the threat they might pose to imperial women. Wealthy households competed to acquire eunuch slaves as status symbols, their ownership demonstrating both affluence and sophistication. Even the church employed eunuchs extensively, their castration seen as a form of spiritual purification that made them suitable for sacred duties. The boys selected for castration were typically between 7 and 12 years old, young enough that their bodies hadn't yet developed secondary sexual characteristics, but old enough to survive the brutal procedure that would transform them into valuable merchandise. They came from every corner of the empire and beyond: Slavic children captured in raids, African boys purchased from traders, even Byzantine children sold by desperate families or seized by creditors to satisfy debts. The castration process itself was a horrific blend of surgical technique and systematic torture. The most skilled practitioners could achieve survival rates of nearly 50%, a remarkable figure considering the primitive medical conditions and the deliberate brutality of the procedure. Boys were typically starved for several days before the operation to reduce the risk of infection, their weakened state making them easier to control during the mutilation that would define the rest of their lives. The actual castration was performed with tools that ranged from sharp knives to crude crushing devices, depending on the desired outcome and the practitioner's skill level. Some procedures removed only the testicles, leaving the penis intact but eliminating the production of male hormones that would drive normal sexual development. Others involved complete removal of all external genitalia, creating smooth, sexless beings who could never pose any sexual threat to their owners' households. The immediate aftermath of castration was a period of agony that many boys didn't survive. Those who lived through the initial trauma faced weeks of recovery during which infection, bleeding, and shock could still claim their lives. The survivors emerged from this ordeal fundamentally changed, not just physically, but psychologically and socially transformed into beings who occupied a unique and tragic position in Byzantine society. The physical effects of prepubescent castration were profound and permanent. Boys who underwent the procedure never developed normal male characteristics. Their voices remained high, their bodies retained childlike proportions, and their facial hair never grew. But the hormonal disruption also caused other changes. Many eunuchs grew unusually tall, developed feminine fat distribution, and suffered from bone weakness and other health problems that would plague them throughout their shortened lives. The psychological impact was even more devastating. These boys had been robbed of their sexual identity at an age when they barely understood what was being taken from them. They would never experience normal romantic relationships, never father children, never know the physical pleasures that defined adult human experience. Their mutilation created a permanent sense of incompleteness that no amount of wealth or status could ever fill. But Byzantine society had developed elaborate justifications for this systematic child abuse. Eunuchs were portrayed as blessed beings who had been freed from the distractions of sexual desire, enabling them to focus entirely on spiritual and intellectual pursuits. Their castration was described as a form of purification that made them more suitable for sacred duties and more trustworthy in positions of authority. The training that followed castration was designed to maximize the value of these mutilated children while ensuring their complete dependence on their owners. Young eunuchs were educated in languages, mathematics, music, and administration skills that would make them valuable as secretaries, tutors, and household managers. But they were also indoctrinated with an ideology of servitude that taught them to see their castration as a blessing and their slavery as a privilege. The most promising eunuch slaves were sent to specialized schools where they received advanced education in preparation for high-level positions in government or the church. These institutions operated like universities, except that their students were mutilated slaves who would never be free to use their education for their own benefit. The irony was profound. Some of the most educated people in the empire were also among its most thoroughly enslaved. The career paths available to eunuchs were both more varied and more limited than those of other slaves. Their castration opened doors to positions of significant authority. Eunuch generals commanded armies, eunuch administrators managed imperial finances, and eunuch bishops led major churches. But these positions came at the cost of their fundamental humanity, their success built on the foundation of their childhood mutilation. The eunuch trade was international in scope, with Byzantine merchants establishing networks that stretched from the slave markets of Central Asia to the auction blocks of North Africa. Specialized traders developed expertise in identifying boys who would survive castration and mature into valuable eunuchs, their human cargo representing investments that could yield enormous profits if properly managed. The legal status of eunuchs was complex and revealing. While they were slaves, their castration gave them certain protections under Byzantine law. They couldn't be used for certain types of manual labor. Their owners had obligations to provide medical care for castration-related health problems, and they had limited rights to own property and conduct business. These legal protections weren't motivated by humanitarian concerns but by the need to protect valuable investments. The silk workshops, where children's fingers bled gold beneath the streets of Constantinople, in workshops that never saw natural light, an army of child slaves labored to create the silk that adorned emperors and enriched merchants. These underground factories were marvels of industrial organization, their efficiency built on the systematic exploitation of children whose small fingers and keen eyesight made them ideal for the delicate work of silk production. But the true horror wasn't in the working conditions, it was in how completely the system had normalized the destruction of childhood in service of luxury. The silk industry was one of Byzantium's most closely guarded secrets and greatest sources of wealth. The techniques for raising silkworms and weaving silk had been stolen from China through industrial espionage that would have impressed any modern corporation. But the empire's competitive advantage lay not in technology but in its willingness to use child labor on a scale that even other slave-owning societies found shocking. Children as young as 5 were purchased specifically for silk work, their youth making them ideal for tasks that required exceptional dexterity and patience. Their small hands could manipulate the delicate silk threads without breaking them, their young eyes could detect flaws that adult workers might miss, and their malleable minds could be shaped to accept working conditions that would drive adults to rebellion or madness. The working day in the silk workshops began before dawn and continued until well after sunset, with only brief breaks for meager meals that provided just enough nutrition to keep the children functional. The workshops themselves were deliberately kept dark to prevent the children from seeing the outside world and developing desires for freedom. Ventilation was minimal, creating an atmosphere thick with silk dust that caused respiratory problems that would plague the workers for their shortened lives. The work itself was both monotonous and demanding. Children spent their days feeding silkworms, harvesting cocoons, spinning thread, and weaving fabric with a precision that required absolute concentration. Any mistake could result in beatings, reduced food rations, or assignment to even more unpleasant tasks. The psychological pressure was enormous. Children lived in constant fear of punishment while being expected to produce work of the highest quality. The training process for new child workers was a masterpiece of systematic indoctrination. Young slaves were taught not just the technical skills of silk production but an ideology that portrayed their work as sacred service to the empire and to God. They were told that their suffering was meaningful, that their sacrifice contributed to the glory of Byzantium, and that their obedience would be rewarded in the afterlife if not in this world. The physical toll on these child workers was devastating and deliberate. The repetitive motions required for silk work caused permanent damage to their hands, wrists, and backs. The poor lighting ruined their eyesight, often leaving them nearly blind by adolescence. The silk dust they breathed daily caused lung diseases that would kill many of them before they reached adulthood. But these health problems were seen as acceptable costs of production, the price of maintaining Byzantium's monopoly on high-quality silk. The psychological damage was even more profound. Children who spent their formative years in these workshops never learned normal social skills or developed healthy relationships. They were isolated from the outside world, cut off from their families, and surrounded only by other traumatized children and brutal overseers. Many developed mental illnesses that would have been recognized as trauma responses if Byzantine society had possessed the psychological understanding to identify them. The workshop hierarchy was designed to prevent solidarity among the child workers while maximizing productivity. Older children were given authority over younger ones, creating a system where the victims became complicit in their own oppression. Those who showed exceptional skill or loyalty might be promoted to supervisory positions, their slightly better treatment buying their cooperation in maintaining the system that had destroyed their own childhoods. The economic value of child-produced silk was enormous, with the finest fabrics commanding prices that could support entire households for years. The empire's wealth was literally woven from the suffering of children, their destroyed lives transformed into luxury goods that adorned the palaces and churches of the powerful. The irony was profound. Silk vestments worn by bishops who preached about protecting the innocent were created by children whose innocence had been systematically destroyed. The international market for Byzantine silk created demand that could only be met through the intensive exploitation of child labor. Merchants from across the known world competed to purchase silk that had been created through methods so brutal that even other slave-owning societies found them shocking. The empire's reputation for producing the world's finest silk was built on its willingness to sacrifice children in ways that its competitors couldn't or wouldn't match. The legal framework governing child workers in the silk industry was complex and revealing. While Byzantine law theoretically protected children from certain forms of abuse, it made specific exceptions for industrial work that was deemed essential to the empire's economic interests. Child slaves in silk workshops had fewer protections than adult slaves, their youth making them more vulnerable to exploitation rather than more deserving of protection. The religious justification for child labor in silk production was elaborate and sophisticated. Church authorities argued that work was spiritually beneficial for children, that suffering built character, and that the production of beautiful fabrics for religious purposes was itself a form of worship. They pointed to biblical passages about the value of hard work and the spiritual benefits of suffering, using scripture to justify practices that destroyed the lives of the most vulnerable members of society. The health care provided to child workers was minimal and focused entirely on maintaining productivity rather than ensuring well-being. Sick children were given just enough medical attention to get them back to work, while those who became too ill or injured to be productive were often abandoned or sold to even less scrupulous masters. The workshops maintained their own burial grounds for children who died on the job, their graves unmarked and their deaths unrecorded except in production statistics. The palace eunuchs, castrated power brokers within the labyrinthine corridors of the Great Palace, a shadow government operated with power that rivaled that of emperors themselves. These were the palace eunuchsmen who had been castrated as children and raised to serve the imperial court, their mutilation transforming them into some of the most influential figures in the Byzantine Empire. But their power came at a price that no amount of wealth or authority could ever repay, their fundamental humanity, sacrificed on the altar of imperial administration. The palace eunuch system represented the ultimate refinement of Byzantine Slaveria hierarchy, so sophisticated that its victims often wielded more practical power than free citizens, yet remained forever marked by the childhood trauma that had created them. These men commanded armies, managed imperial finances, and advised emperors on matters of life and death, all while bearing the physical and psychological scars of their systematic mutilation. The selection process for palace eunuchs was ruthlessly meritocratic within its horrific constraints. The most intelligent and physically attractive boys were identified early and subjected to the finest education the empire could provide. They learned languages, mathematics, theology, law, and military strategy, their castration opening doors to knowledge that would have been closed to them as intact men. But this education came at the cost of their sexual identity, their intellectual development forever shadowed by the trauma of their mutilation. The career paths available to palace eunuchs were both more varied and more constrained than those of any other group in Byzantine society. They could rise to positions of enormous authority, commanding armies, governing provinces, and managing the empire's vast bureaucracy. But they could never found dynasties, never pass their positions to biological heirs, never threaten the imperial succession through their own ambitions. Their castration made them simultaneously more powerful and more powerless than intact men. The psychological profile of successful palace eunuchs was complex and tragic. Many developed a fierce loyalty to the imperial system that had mutilated them, their identity so completely bound up with their service that they couldn't imagine existence outside the palace walls. Others became master manipulators, using their unique position to accumulate wealth and influence while nursing grievances that could never be openly expressed. All bore the invisible wounds of childhood trauma that shaped their personalities in ways that would never fully heal. The daily life of palace eunuchs was a constant balance between privilege and humiliation. They lived in luxury that most free citizens could never imagine, with fine clothing, excellent food, and comfortable quarters. But they were also subject to the whims of emperors who could order their execution, exile, or torture without warning or justification. Their elevated status was always precarious, dependent on maintaining the favor of rulers who saw them as useful tools rather than human beings. The relationships between palace eunuchs were complicated by their shared trauma and competing ambitions. Some formed deep friendships based on their mutual understanding of what they had endured, while others became bitter rivals competing for imperial favor. Many developed surrogate family relationships with younger eunuchs, their inability to have biological children channeled into mentoring relationships that could be both nurturing and exploitative. The sexual lives of palace eunuchs were a source of constant speculation and occasional scandal. While their castration had eliminated their ability to reproduce, many retained some capacity for sexual activity and formed relationships that challenged Byzantine assumptions about gender and sexuality. Some became lovers of emperors or empresses, their castration making them safe partners for rulers who couldn't risk the political complications of normal adultery. The religious status of palace eunuchs was complex and contradictory. While some church authorities viewed their castration as a form of spiritual purification that made them ideal for sacred service, others saw them as abominations whose mutilation violated God's design for human sexuality. Many eunuchs themselves struggled with questions about their spiritual status, wondering whether their castration had damned them or blessed them in the eyes of God. The wealth that successful palace eunuchs could accumulate was enormous, with some becoming richer than provincial governors or military commanders. But their wealth was always vulnerable to confiscation by emperors who could seize their property without legal recourse. Many eunuchs invested heavily in religious foundations and charitable works, perhaps hoping to buy spiritual salvation or simply to create legacies that would outlast their own lives. The international influence of Byzantine palace eunuchs extended far beyond the empire's borders. Eunuch diplomats negotiated treaties with foreign powers, eunuch generals commanded armies that conquered distant territories, and eunuch administrators managed trade networks that stretched across the known world. Their castration, which had been intended to limit their power, paradoxically enabled them to wield influence on a global scale. The decline of individual palace eunuchs was often as dramatic as their rise. Those who fell from imperial favor might find themselves stripped of wealth, exiled to remote monasteries, or executed on trumped-up charges. Their lack of biological heirs meant that their accumulated power and wealth typically died with them, preventing the formation of eunuch dynasties that might have challenged imperial authority. The domestic hell, slavery in Byzantine households behind the marble facades of Constantinople's finest homes, a different kind of slavery flourished, one that was intimate, pervasive, and often more psychologically devastating than the industrial exploitation of workshops and mines. Domestic slavery in Byzantine households was a system so deeply embedded in daily life that it had become invisible to those who benefited from it, while creating a living hell for those trapped within its confines. The typical wealthy Byzantine household might contain dozens of slaves performing every conceivable domestic function. There were slaves to cook and clean, slaves to tend gardens and manage livestock, slaves to educate children and entertain guests, slaves to handle correspondence and manage finances. But unlike the impersonal brutality of industrial slavery, domestic bondage was characterized by its intimacy. Masters and slaves lived in close proximity, their lives intertwined in ways that made the power imbalance even more psychologically damaging. The selection of domestic slaves was a careful process that considered not just physical capabilities but personality traits and psychological profiles. Masters wanted slaves who would be obedient without being sullen, intelligent without being threatening, attractive without being sexually tempting, unless that was specifically desired. The ideal domestic slave was one who had been so thoroughly broken and rebuilt that they genuinely desired to serve, their own will completely subordinated to their master's wishes. The training of domestic slaves began in childhood and continued throughout their lives. Young slaves were taught not just practical skills but an entire worldview that portrayed their servitude as natural and beneficial. They learned to anticipate their master's needs, to remain invisible when not needed, and to accept punishment without resentment. The psychological conditioning was so thorough that many domestic slaves developed a form of Stockholm syndrome, genuinely caring for masters who owned them like property. The daily routine of domestic slaves was characterized by its unpredictability and constant surveillance. They might be awakened at any hour to serve their master's needs, work for 18 hours without rest, or be punished for infractions they didn't know they had committed. The lack of privacy or personal time was absolute. Domestic slaves existed entirely for their master's convenience, their own needs and desires irrelevant to the household's functioning. The sexual exploitation of domestic slaves was systematic and legally protected. Female slaves were expected to provide sexual services to their masters, their consent irrelevant to transactions that were considered property rights rather than human interactions. Male slaves might be used sexually by their masters or rented out to guests, their bodies commodified in ways that would have been criminal if applied to free citizens. The children born from these sexual encounters became slaves themselves, their mixed heritage often making them valuable as exotic curiosities. The psychological warfare within domestic slavery was sophisticated and relentless. Masters deliberately created competition among their slaves, rewarding loyalty and punishing solidarity. They used information gathered through intimate contact to manipulate their slaves' emotions, exploiting knowledge of their fears, desires, and relationships to maintain control. The close quarters of domestic life meant that slaves had no escape from their master's psychological manipulation, no private space where they could maintain their own identity. The hierarchy among domestic slaves was complex and deliberately divisive. House slaves looked down on field slaves, personal servants felt superior to kitchen workers, and slaves with special skills or relationships with the master enjoyed privileges that others envied. This internal stratification prevented unity among the enslaved population while creating incentives for slaves to compete for their master's favor rather than cooperate in resistance. The religious indoctrination of domestic slaves was particularly intensive because of their close contact with their masters' families. They were required to participate in Christian worship, to learn prayers and hymns, and to demonstrate piety that their masters found convincing. But this religious education was used as another tool of control, with biblical passages about obedience and suffering used to justify their continued bondage and discourage thoughts of rebellion. The medical care provided to domestic slaves was better than that available to industrial workers but was still focused primarily on maintaining their usefulness rather than ensuring their well-being. Sick slaves received treatment that would restore their ability to work, while chronic conditions that didn't interfere with their duties were often ignored. The intimate knowledge that masters had of their slaves' bodies was used to detect signs of pregnancy, illness, or aging that might affect their value. The emotional relationships between masters and domestic slaves were complex and often deeply dysfunctional. Some masters developed genuine affection for slaves who had served them faithfully for years, while others remained coldly indifferent to the suffering they caused. Many slaves experienced confused feelings toward masters who might show them kindness one day and cruelty the next, their emotional responses shaped by the psychological dynamics of captivity and dependence. The punishment of domestic slaves was often more creative and psychologically damaging than the straightforward brutality used in industrial settings. Masters who lived closely with their slaves understood their individual vulnerabilities and could tailor punishments to cause maximum psychological damage. A slave might be forced to watch their child being beaten, compelled to destroy something they had created, or made to participate in the punishment of other slaves they cared about. The manumission of domestic slaves was rare and often came with conditions that maintained their dependence on their former masters. Freed slaves might be required to continue working for their former owners, to provide financial support in their old age, or to remain celibate to avoid complications with inheritance. The promise of eventual freedom was often used as a tool of control, with masters dangling the possibility of manumission to encourage good behavior while rarely following through on their promises. The theological justification, how Christianity enabled slavery. Perhaps the most shocking aspect of Byzantine slavery was how completely it had been integrated into Christian theology and practice. The empire that saw itself as the earthly representative of Christ's kingdom had developed elaborate theological justifications for human bondage that would have made pagan slave owners blush with shame. This wasn't simply a case of Christians failing to live up to their ideal. It was a systematic perversion of Christian doctrine that transformed the religion of liberation into a tool of oppression. The theological foundation for Byzantine slavery rested on a selective reading of Scripture that emphasized passages supporting social hierarchy while ignoring those that proclaimed human equality. Church fathers pointed to Paul's letters that commanded slaves to obey their masters, to the Old Testament's acceptance of slavery, and to Christ's failure to explicitly condemn the institution. They argued that slavery was part of God's plan for human society, a necessary hierarchy that reflected the cosmic order of heaven itself. The doctrine of original sin was particularly useful for justifying slavery. Theologians argued that humanity's fallen nature made hierarchy and domination inevitable, that some people were naturally suited for bondage while others were destined to rule. They claimed that slavery was actually beneficial for the enslaved, protecting them from the spiritual dangers of freedom while providing them with Christian masters who could guide their souls toward salvation. The Church's own extensive use of slave labor made theological justification essential for maintaining institutional credibility. Monasteries owned thousands of slaves who worked their lands, built their buildings, and performed their domestic labor. Bishops lived in luxury supported by slave labor while preaching about spiritual poverty and Christian humility. The contradiction was so glaring that elaborate theological gymnastics were required to explain how an institution dedicated to following Christ could so thoroughly embrace practices that Christ himself would have condemned. The sacramental system was adapted to accommodate slavery in ways that revealed the Church's complete acceptance of human bondage. Slaves could be baptized and receive communion, but their spiritual equality was carefully separated from any claims to social or legal equality. They were taught that their souls were equal in God's eyes while their bodies remained property to be bought and sold. This theological sleight of hand allowed Christians to maintain their belief in human dignity while participating in systems that systematically violated that dignity. The concept of spiritual slavery was developed to make physical bondage seem less significant by comparison. Theologians argued that all humans were slaves to sin and that physical slavery was merely an external reflection of this spiritual reality. They claimed that a slave who accepted their bondage with Christian resignation was actually freer than a master who was enslaved by pride and worldly desires. This theological framework made slavery seem not just acceptable but spiritually beneficial for those who endured it with proper Christian attitude. The Church's role in the slave trade was extensive and systematic. Monasteries bought and sold slaves like any other commodity, bishops blessed slave ships before they departed on trading voyages, and church courts enforced contracts for slave sales. The institution that claimed to follow the Prince of Peace had become one of the largest participants in a system that reduced human beings to property and treated their suffering as a source of profit. The education of slave children in Christian doctrine was used as another tool of control rather than liberation. Young slaves were taught that their bondage was God's will, that obedience to their masters was a form of worship, and that their suffering would be rewarded in the afterlife if they endured it without complaint. The gospel message of liberation was transformed into a justification for continued oppression, the promise of heavenly freedom used to discourage earthly resistance. The saints and martyrs of the Church were reinterpreted to support slavery rather than challenge it. Stories of Christian slaves who had endured suffering without rebellion were held up as models of virtue, while accounts of those who had resisted their bondage were suppressed or rewritten. The Church created a pantheon of enslaved saints whose primary virtue was their acceptance of their condition rather than their struggle for freedom. The liturgical calendar was adapted to reinforce the theological justification for slavery. Feast days celebrated saints who had been slaves, sermons on appropriate Sundays emphasized the spiritual benefits of suffering, and prayers were offered for the souls of the enslaved that focused on their need for patience and obedience rather than justice and liberation. The entire rhythm of Christian worship was structured to support a system that violated the fundamental principles of the faith it claimed to represent. The theological treatment of slave families was particularly revealing of the Church's moral bankruptcy. While Christian doctrine emphasized the sanctity of marriage and family, these principles were suspended when applied to slaves. Slave marriages had no legal standing and could be dissolved at their master's whim. Children could be separated from parents without regard for emotional bonds. The Church that preached about the importance of family life systematically destroyed slave families while offering theological justifications for this destruction. The concept of Christian charity was perverted to support slavery rather than challenge it. Masters were praised for treating their slaves with relative kindness, as if basic human decency toward people they owned was a form of virtue rather than a minimal moral obligation. The church encouraged masters to provide religious instruction to their slaves, to allow them to attend worship services, and to avoid excessive cruelty reforms that made slavery more palatable without challenging its fundamental injustice. The economics of human misery, how slavery powered an empire. The Byzantine Empire's economic foundation rested on a system of human exploitation so vast and sophisticated that it dwarfed the slave economies of other civilizations. This wasn't simply a matter of using unpaid labor to reduce costs, it was a comprehensive economic system that had transformed human suffering into the empire's primary source of wealth and competitive advantage. Every aspect of Byzantine prosperity, from its magnificent architecture to its international trade dominance, was built on the systematic exploitation of millions of enslaved human beings. The scale of Byzantine slavery was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that slaves comprised at least 30% of the empire's population, with some regions reaching 50% or higher. This meant that millions of people lived their entire lives as property, their labor extracted without compensation, their bodies owned by others, their children born into bondage. The economic value represented by this human property was enormous, greater than the empire's gold reserves, more valuable than its territorial holdings, more important to its prosperity than its famous trade routes. The productivity gains from slave labor were carefully calculated and maximized through sophisticated management techniques. Byzantine slave owners had learned to extract optimal work from their human property through a combination of incentives and punishments that would have impressed modern efficiency experts. They understood that well-fed slaves worked harder than starving ones, that skilled slaves were more valuable than unskilled ones, and that the threat of punishment was often more effective than punishment itself. The specialization of slave labor had reached levels that rivaled modern industrial production. There were slaves who did nothing but tend silkworms, slaves whose only job was copying manuscripts, slaves who specialized in particular types of metalwork or textile production. This specialization increased productivity while making slaves more dependent on their masters. A skilled silk weaver couldn't easily escape to become a farmer, and a trained scribe couldn't survive as a manual laborer. The international trade in slaves was one of Byzantium's most profitable enterprises. The empire served as a hub for slave trading networks that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Indian Ocean, with Constantinople's slave market setting prices that influenced human trafficking across the known world. Byzantine merchants had developed sophisticated techniques for evaluating, transporting, and marketing human cargo, their expertise in human trafficking making them wealthy while spreading misery across continents. The financial instruments developed to support the slave trade were remarkably advanced. There were insurance policies to protect against the loss of valuable slaves, credit arrangements to finance large purchases, and investment schemes that allowed multiple parties to share ownership of particularly expensive human property. The banking houses of Constantinople had developed expertise in slave-related finance that made them leaders in what was essentially a global market in human misery. The tax revenue generated by slave ownership was enormous and essential to imperial finances. Slaves were taxed as property, their owners paying annual assessments based on their human holdings. Slave sales generated transaction taxes, slave labor produced goods that were subject to trade taxes, and the wealth created by slave exploitation funded the military forces that captured more slaves to feed the system. The empire's fiscal health depended on maintaining and expanding its slave population. The competitive advantages that slave labor provided were decisive in many industries. Byzantine silk could undersell competitors because it was produced by children working 18-hour days for no wages. Byzantine ships could operate more cheaply because they were powered by slaves who received only minimal food and shelter. Byzantine construction projects could be completed faster and cheaper because they used slave labor that could be worked to death and easily replaced. The innovation driven by slave exploitation was both impressive and horrifying. Byzantine engineers had developed new techniques for housing large numbers of slaves efficiently, new methods for transporting human cargo safely, and new systems for managing slave labor productively. They had created an industrial infrastructure for human exploitation that was more sophisticated than anything that would be seen again until the modern era. The economic calculations that governed slave treatment were coldly rational. Masters learned to balance the costs of maintaining their human property against the benefits of their labor, optimizing for maximum lifetime productivity rather than immediate output. They understood that some investment in slave welfare, better food, basic medical care, minimal rest could pay dividends in increased productivity and longer working lives. The replacement costs for slaves were carefully factored into economic planning. Masters knew that industrial slaves might last only a few years under harsh working conditions, while domestic slaves could remain productive for decades if properly maintained. These calculations influenced decisions about how slaves were used, with the most valuable being preserved for longer-term exploitation while others were worked to death in more demanding roles. The economic impact of slave resistance was significant enough to influence management practices throughout the empire. Rebellions disrupted production, escapes represented lost capital, and sabotage could destroy valuable equipment and products. Masters invested heavily in security measures, surveillance systems, and psychological control techniques designed to prevent resistance while maintaining productivity. The intergenerational wealth transfer enabled by slavery was enormous. Slave-owning families could pass their human property to their children, creating dynasties built on inherited exploitation. The children and grandchildren of slaves automatically became property themselves, ensuring that the economic benefits of slavery would continue across generations without any additional investment in acquisition costs. The resistance, when the enslaved fought back despite the overwhelming power of the Byzantine slave system and the sophisticated methods used to control human property, resistance never completely disappeared. In workshops and households, on ships and in mines, enslaved people found ways to fight back against their oppression, their acts of defiance ranging from subtle sabotage to open rebellion. But in a system designed to anticipate and crush resistance, every act of defiance carried enormous risks and often resulted in consequences that were worse than the original oppression. The forms of resistance were as varied as the people who attempted them. Some slaves chose direct confrontation, attacking their masters or overseers with whatever weapons they could find. Others opted for more subtle forms of defiance, deliberately working slowly, damaging equipment, or providing false information when questioned. The most sophisticated resistance involved organized efforts to escape, to communicate with other slaves, or to coordinate acts of sabotage that could disrupt the entire system. The psychological resistance was often the most important and the most dangerous. Slaves who maintained their sense of human dignity, who refused to internalize the ideology of their oppression, who continued to hope for freedom, these individuals posed the greatest threat to a system that depended on the complete submission of its victims. The masters understood this and developed elaborate techniques for detecting and crushing psychological resistance before it could spread to other slaves. The communication networks that developed among slaves were remarkable for their sophistication and their secrecy. Despite constant surveillance and severe punishments for unauthorized contact, slaves found ways to share information, coordinate activities, and maintain connections across vast distances. They developed coded languages, secret signals, and hidden meeting places that allowed them to organize resistance while avoiding detection by their masters. The escape attempts were perhaps the most dramatic form of resistance, though they were also the most dangerous. Slaves who tried to flee faced not only the physical challenges of crossing hostile territory without resources, but also the certainty that recapture would result in torture and death. The few successful escapes became legends among the slave population, their stories whispered in secret as proof that freedom was possible even in the most hopeless circumstances. The sabotage of equipment and products was a form of resistance that could be both effective and relatively safe if done skillfully. Slaves learned to introduce flaws into silk fabric that would only become apparent after sale, to damage tools in ways that appeared accidental, and to contaminate food supplies without being detected. These acts of sabotage could cause significant economic damage while being difficult to trace to specific individuals. The religious resistance was particularly significant in a society where Christianity was used to justify slavery. Some slaves maintained their original religious beliefs in secret, practicing forbidden rituals and preserving cultural traditions that connected them to their pre-slavery identities. Others developed syncretic religious practices that combined Christian elements with resistance ideologies, creating theological frameworks that challenged the official justifications for their bondage. The family bonds that masters tried to destroy often became sources of resistance strength. Parents would risk severe punishment to protect their children, spouses would sacrifice themselves for each other, and siblings would coordinate their resistance efforts despite the dangers involved. The love that survived despite systematic attempts to destroy it became a form of resistance that masters found particularly threatening because it was so difficult to eliminate. The solidarity among slaves was constantly threatened by the system's divide-and-conquer tactics, but it never completely disappeared. Slaves would share food with those who were starving, provide comfort to those who were suffering, and protect each other from the worst excesses of their master's cruelty. These acts of mutual aid were forms of resistance that maintained human dignity in the face of systematic dehumanization. The intellectual resistance was particularly important among educated slaves who had been forced to use their knowledge in service of their oppressors. Some deliberately provided false information, others introduced subtle errors into their work, and many found ways to preserve and transmit knowledge that their masters wanted to suppress. The scribes who copied manuscripts, the teachers who educated slave children, and the administrators who managed slave operations all found ways to resist through their intellectual work. The sexual resistance was one of the most dangerous forms of defiance because it challenged masters' sense of absolute ownership over their slaves' bodies. Some slaves refused sexual advances despite the severe punishments that would follow, others found ways to prevent pregnancy that would create more slaves, and many maintained romantic relationships that their masters had forbidden. These acts of sexual autonomy were seen as particularly threatening because they asserted slaves' humanity in the most intimate sphere of life. The economic resistance took many forms, from the deliberate destruction of valuable property to the theft of goods that could be used to support escape attempts or resistance activities. Slaves learned to manipulate the economic systems that oppressed them, finding ways to divert resources, disrupt production, and impose costs on their masters that went far beyond the immediate value of stolen or damaged goods. The cultural resistance involved the preservation and transmission of languages, traditions, and identities that the slave system was designed to destroy. Slaves would teach their children songs and stories from their homelands, maintain traditional crafts and skills, and preserve memories of freedom that could inspire future resistance. This cultural preservation was a form of resistance that looked toward the future, maintaining the possibility that enslaved peoples could one day reclaim their heritage and their freedom. The consequences of resistance were severe and deliberately designed to deter others from following similar paths. Captured runaways were often tortured to death in public, their suffering serving as a warning to other slaves about the futility of escape attempts. Saboteurs were mutilated in ways that would make them unable to repeat their crimes while serving as visible reminders of the consequences of defiance. The families of resistors were often punished collectively, their suffering used to discourage others from risking similar acts of defiance. But despite the terrible consequences, resistance continued throughout the history of Byzantine slavery. Each act of defiance, no matter how small or unsuccessful, represented an assertion of human dignity that the system could never completely crush. The slaves who fought back, who maintained their humanity despite systematic attempts to destroy it, who preserved hope in the face of overwhelming oppression, these individuals kept alive the possibility that the system of slavery could one day be overthrown. As we emerge from this journey into the heart of Byzantine slavery, we must confront the uncomfortable reality that this system of human exploitation existed not in some barbaric society, but in the heart of what was considered the most civilized empire of its time. The Byzantines weren't monsters, they were people much like ourselves, with the same capacity for love and cruelty, creation and destruction, faith and hypocrisy that characterizes all human societies. The sophistication of Byzantine slavery was perhaps its most disturbing feature. This wasn't the crude brutality of primitive raiders, but a carefully constructed system that had been refined over centuries to maximize the extraction of human value while minimizing the costs of resistance. The legal frameworks, the theological justifications, the economic calculations, the management techniques, all of these elements combined to create a machine for human exploitation that was more efficient and more durable than anything the world had seen before. The victims of this system were real people with names, families, dreams, and fears that were systematically destroyed by their oppressors. They were children torn from their parents, women forced into sexual slavery, men castrated to serve their master's convenience, and entire populations reduced to property that could be bought and sold like livestock. Their suffering was not abstract or theoretical but immediate and personal, their pain as real as anything we might experience today. The perpetrators of this system were also real people, Christians who attended church regularly, parents who loved their children, scholars who created beautiful art and profound philosophy. They weren't evil in any simple sense, but they had created and participated in a system that was evil in its effects, regardless of their intentions. Their ability to compartmentalize their humanity, to separate their private morality from their public participation in slavery, reveals something disturbing about the human capacity for moral blindness. The legacy of Byzantine slavery extends far beyond its historical period. The techniques for controlling human beings, the justifications for systematic exploitation, the economic models based on unpaid labor, all of these elements would influence later systems of bondage and continue to shape human societies in various forms today. Understanding this history is not about assigning blame to modern peoples for ancient crimes, but about recognizing the patterns that allow such systematic exploitation to occur and working to prevent their repetition. The theological corruption that enabled Byzantine slavery is particularly relevant for modern religious communities. The way that Christianity was perverted to justify human bondage, the selective reading of Scripture that supported oppression while ignoring liberation, the institutional participation in systems that violated the faith's fundamental principles, these patterns have been repeated throughout history and continue to influence religious thought and practice today. So tell us, what aspect of Byzantine slavery do you find most shocking? The systematic castration of children, the theological justification for human bondage, the economic sophistication of the exploitation, or the way that resistance was crushed while maintaining the appearance of Christian civilization? How do these historical patterns relate to modern forms of exploitation and abuse? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this exploration into one of history's most sophisticated systems of human exploitation has opened your eyes to the depths of institutionalized cruelty, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next journey into the shadows of the past. Remember, the stories we tell on Scandalous Pasts are fictional narratives that may be inspired by real historical events, but are not presented as historical fact. Until next time, remember that the true measure of any civilization is not found in its monuments or achievements, but in how it treats the most vulnerable members of society. The Byzantine Empire failed this test catastrophically, and their system of slavery stands as a permanent reminder of what happens when sophisticated societies convince themselves that some human beings are less than human. The domes of Hagia Sophia may still inspire awe, but beneath their beauty lies the memory of millions who suffered and died to build and maintain the empire that created them. Their voices may be silent now, but their stories echo through history, warning us that the capacity for such systematic cruelty lies dormant in every society, waiting for the right combination of opportunity, justification, and moral blindness to awaken it once again.